You are listening to Social Europe podcast. We discuss cutting-edge thinking on politics, economy, and employment and labour with some of the most thought-provoking people around, including Nobel Prize winners and other internationally acclaimed experts. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
This episode of Social Europe podcast is brought to you by the Said Business School, University of Oxford. The Oxford Executive MBA enables current and future business leaders to make a difference in their chosen field. The part-time program is designed to fit alongside your work commitments and offers you a global network. Visit the Said Business School, University of Oxford website for further details.
Welcome everyone to the latest Social Europe podcast. My name is Robin Wilson. I'm the acting editor-in-chief of Social Europe, and my distinguished guest today is Vivien Schmidt, Professor of International Relations and Political Science in the Pardee School at Boston University. Her latest book is entitled Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the eurozone. And it is this crisis of legitimacy in Europe which we're going to discuss today. Many thanks, Vivien, for giving generously of your time. Now, to clear the ground, many people can grasp the general notion of a crisis of legitimacy in Europe in recent years, given such symptoms as the rise of far-right populist parties and divisions along north, south, and east-west lines. But to get to the diagnosis, you talk in terms of input, output, and throughput legitimacy. What do these terms mean, and where do you locate Europe's legitimacy crisis among them?
Okay, thanks for that great question. And I think to begin, it's important to note that there are two ways of thinking about legitimacy. One, in the most basic sense, is public consent to or trust in a governing authority. So it's public acceptance of governing activities, which reinforce or undermine governing authority, is the second kind. So one is governing authority. Number two is governing activities. So in the EU, we can talk about governing authority having built up slowly over time, policy area by policy area. The question is, what's happened in terms of governing activities? And one could argue that just as in terms of governing authority, governing activities have been legitimated over time, tacitly accepted by the people and national governments in most areas. Not in the eurozone, because the eurozone crisis was essentially a crisis of legitimacy in governing activities that actually caused problems for governing authority. But now you ask me a more specific question than that, which is these different types of legitimacy: input, output, throughput. So very sorry for the jargon, but these are the terms that are often used in European studies. They're systems terms, but they're actually very easy to understand. Output legitimacy is about policy effectiveness and performance. Input legitimacy is really is a political criterion, and it's about political participation and representation, but also government's responsiveness to citizens' concerns and desires. And the final criterion, the final legitimizing mechanism, is what I call throughput legitimacy, which is really about procedural quality. And these are terms that have often been used here or there, but not put together. But they're important because it's all about procedures and their quality. So one is efficacy, the efficiency of governance. And the next is accountability, and that's for EU actors to be held accountable and to give accounts to particular forums, whether of expertise or of politicians, as in parliaments, and also to the forum of public opinion. Another such criterion is transparency, which is, of course, easy access to information and often closely linked to accountability. And finally, there's inclusiveness and openness, bringing in as many people as appropriate and being open, balanced, and fair in all of this. So these are the three types of legitimacy I talk about. And in the book, I actually focus particularly on throughput legitimacy, although not to the exclusion of the other two. And this is because it seems to me that in the eurozone, most importantly, especially in the crisis, is that there's a tremendous focus on procedures. This kind of, in the subtitle of the book, it's governing by rules and ruling by numbers in the eurozone. And the problem, as I conceive of it, is that in the eurozone, when the crisis hits, all EU actors respond with, all we have to do is reinforce the rules, and i.e. procedural legitimacy or throughput, and we'll have good output, so good performance, policy, effective policies and performance, and therefore it doesn't matter that the citizens haven't voted for this or even don't like it. Because the assumption is follow the rules, double down on the rules, you'll get good performance and people will be happy. And of course, very quickly thereafter, we see that that is not the case. People are unhappy and the poor performance is highly problematic. So that's sort of the basic take on legitimacy.
Okay, so you're focused primarily, Vivien, on throughput legitimacy. And what you're saying is that during the eurozone crisis, to take that as an example, a very important one in recent years, that what the institutions of the European Union did was to think that they had legitimacy because they were sticking to the procedures and that those would deliver results. Why do you think in that context they kept sticking to the procedures and kept thinking they would deliver the results when clearly from quite an early stage it was looking like there was a protracted crisis ahead?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about that is so the first response was essentially, as I said, it's governing by rules and ruling by numbers in 2010, with the assumption that all you needed to do is follow the rules and you had good policy performance, so there's no need for the citizens to be involved, no need for input. But this, I think, as most EU actors came to see, was legitimacy was increasingly at risk because of deteriorating economics and increasingly toxic politics. And the response of EU actors by 2012, 2015, as the crisis slows, is a recognition, well, we've got to do something different. And what we saw was a reinterpretation of the rules and numbers, but by stealth. No one could admit to it. But so what happened was you got easing of the rules, incremental improvement, but you still had suboptimal rules and continued perceptions of legitimacy. You know, it's as if there's sort of the constant discussion of austerity and structural reform, even as there was a lessening of austerity and shifting of definitions of structural reform meant that you still had Southern Europeans feeling oppressed even when they were accommodated, and the Germans, Northern Europeans, feeling deceived regardless. This is 2013 to 2015. By 2015 and on, especially with a new commission, the Juncker Commission, EU actors generally admit to the reinterpretations in order to gain more legitimacy, better results, and to try to reduce the rise of populism, but the damage had already been done.
Now, you mentioned there, Vivien, the specific role of the Commission. Obviously, the role of the European Central Bank was very important, particularly with Mario Draghi's whatever it takes a statement. But we can also bring into this discussion the European Council and the European Parliament. To focus, to drill down a little further into the institutions, so what does your analysis indicate to you about the role that specific institutions played during the crisis?
So that's a very important question, and that's actually the crux of the book. What I try to do is drill down into EU actors' different pathways to legitimacy, in particular with a focus on the procedural legitimacy, but also how that affects both the performance or output legitimacy and input legitimacy. But as I approached this problem, I thought to myself, well, yeah, but I'm talking about legitimacy. You can't simply say, oh, you were illegitimate and you were legitimate, or that they were all illegitimate. One needs to, when you're talking about legitimacy, actually try to assess legitimacy, not only from a kind of outside expert's view, but also from the actors' views themselves. How did they see themselves in terms of legitimacy? What I did when I decided I was going to be talking about legitimacy is you can't simply say you're legitimate or you're illegitimate. One needs to take all the various viewpoints. So not only sort of what could be called an objective viewpoint from outside experts, but also the view of EU actors themselves, how they see their own legitimacy, and of course, how the public responds, how citizens respond. So in order to do this, I thought best way to approach this is to take a Janist-faced view. In other words, what are the arguments that suggest that EU actors were not legitimate, and what are the full set of arguments that would suggest, well, perhaps they really are legitimate in terms of what they did. And so for this, I will go and in the book, you see there's each one chapter after another that this discusses the different institutional actors. So to begin with the council, my question there was the council a dictatorship led by Germany and its Northern European coalition in one-size-fits-one rules, and the one, of course, is Germany? Or could it be seen as a deliberative body, a kind of mutually accountable deliberative body? And both, you can make very strong arguments on both sides. On the side of dictator, consider that Germany essentially was the heavyweight in the room, and it used its power essentially to ensure that it got its interests. In terms of economic interests, it was against having a transfer union, and in fact also ensured that its banks were essentially bailed out. This was debtors versus creditors, and the creditors won out and the debtors had to pay, and Germany, as the biggest creditor, got the most. So that's the economic side for Germany as dictator. In terms of the politics, we have to remember that at the outset of the crisis, Merkel basically said, no, let Germany deal with its own problems, because Merkel was very worried about a regional election in North Rhine-Westphalia. So political interest played a role. Legal interest, the constitutional court that was constantly breathing down German government's backs. And then even when we shift to, but you could argue, well, this was a Franco-German couple after all. But no, it was really Merkel. Remember, it was Merkozy. And Merkel essentially got her way most of the time, including in imposing certain kinds of demands, such as haircuts on investors that was going to come online after. But this was 2010, and the result was the markets panicked and started attacking Ireland. So Greek bailout happens, and then immediately Merkozy says, no, we're going to set up the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, and there are going to be haircuts there. And the markets read this as, oh my God, we're going to lose money. And they start pounding Ireland. And then they pound Portugal. So for all of these reasons, one could argue that this was actually a dictatorship led by Germany with its Northern European coalition, Finland, the Netherlands in particular. But actually, you can make a very convincing opposite argument that the council was actually a deliberative body that was mutually accountable. After all, How do we explain that everyone agreed on the rules? All member state leaders in council meeting after council meeting agreed. Okay, this was deliberation in the shadow of Germany, but it was deliberation. And then if you look across time, Germany did not get its interests, or rather it changed over time. So we started in 2010 with a discourse of stability, but by 2012, Mario Monti comes in saying we want growth. François Hollande, French president, comes in and says, yes, yes, we do. And the discourse becomes growth, but as Merkel said, with stability. By 2014, Matteo Renzi comes in saying we need flexibility. And Merkel says, okay, flexibility within the stability rules. By 2015, it's about investment as the Juncker Commission comes in. All of this suggests that there's actually a lot of deliberation going on. So I think one could argue that that there's a balance here, that for the non-program countries, for kind of normal countries, you can make, I think, successful arguments. On the one hand, dictatorship, on the other, a deliberative, mutually accountable deliberative body. However, once we move to the program countries, here we're talking about Greece, Ireland, and Portugal, then I think, your alternatives, neither are very nice. Harsh dictatorship in the case of Greece, third bailout, or at best, deliberative authoritarianism in the case of Greece, first and second bailouts, Ireland and Portugal. Because after all, yes, they were deliberating, but about the programs that were being imposed on them. And certainly one can look at the Troika and the Eurogroup of finance ministers as wholly unaccountable and non-transparent as they push for harsh austerity and structural reform programs that crush unions and cut the welfare state in those countries. So that's the Council. Next, the European Central Bank. Here, the question is, was it the hero of the crisis, doing whatever it takes to save the euro, or was it an ogre imposing austerity and structural reform on everyone else? So the hero, what you can say is that actually the ECB, within the limits set to it, managed slowly but surely to reinterpret its mandate in plain view as it communicated over and over again as it changed. It went from a highly restrictive definition of what it could do. It was all about, Trichet said, this is all about credibility. We're not a lender of last resort. But slowly but surely, Mario Draghi, 2012, says we're going to do whatever it takes to save the euro within our mandate, shifts to a discourse of stability in the medium term, and ultimately comes very close to being a lender of last resort, in particular with quantitative easing. So this is really about shifting the way in which it was defined. And it does this, interestingly enough, I think via expert networks, via opening itself up to sort of the wider central banking policy community, to convince other members of the board that it was on the right track, so much so that it managed to isolate the Bundesbank in the end. But it's not just about a kind of accountability to technical forums. It's also to the European Parliament, to the political forum. And here what you see increasingly is the ECB uses its quarterly meetings with the European Parliament to legitimate what it does, not only to the Parliament itself, but to the forum of public opinion. So all very important. So that makes it the hero. But, there's a lot that makes it look very much like an ogre, in particular in that first period. It's got a complete lack of accountability. As the ECB says, yes, we'll engage in various kinds of monetary transactions, in particular OMT, as Mario Draghi says, we'll do whatever it takes. There's a quid pro quo for fiscal consolidation if Spain and Italy would have to go into a program. I mean, that basically, if the ECB were to buy Italian and Spanish bonds, which it didn't have to do, as it turns out, because the markets backed off, But had it had to do that, Italy and Spain would have had to go into a fiscal consolidation program. There's also a lack of transparency as another aspect of the ogre-like qualities of the ECB. Think about President Trichet's secret letters to prime ministers, basically telling them, we're going to pull the plug on your economy unless you go into a program, a conditionality program. And of course, there's a lack of efficacy. The ECB waited way too long on doing what it should have done as a lender of last resort and quantitative easing. All we need to do is look at the US Fed and the Bank of England to see that they began quantitative easing immediately. So I've given you the Council, the ECB. What about the Commission? Here, you've got to ask, were they ayatollahs of austerity or ministers of moderation? Certainly in the first 2 years, they look very much like ayatollahs of austerity as they're the enforcers in the European semester's one-size-fits-all policies. And certainly in the Troika, they are the enforcer for the Eurogroup. However, by 2013 and on in particular, but perhaps even before, they become increasingly ministers of moderation. After all, if you think about where they are, they're between a rock and a hard place. The rock is Northern Europe. The hard place is Southern Europe. And as output fails, performance fails, they themselves recognize we need to do something. And that's where you see increasing throughput flexibility. What they do immediately is they slow deficit reduction, and they change the definition of structural reform. In the beginning, in the annual growth survey, it's all about crush the unions, cut the welfare state. By 2013, 2014, it's talk to the social partners, do whatever you can, and address issues of poverty. The problem for the Commission, especially in this 2013 to 2015 period, is Ali Rehn, the commissioner's discourse was still Ayatollah-like, which was a problem for the legitimacy of the Commission. With the Juncker Commission in 2015, what you see is a shift. They begin telling the truth about flexibility, but rules are rules, of course, so they introduce rules for flexibility. Okay, I think this is all about accountability as well. Finally, with the Parliament, the question here is, was it a talking shop with no size fits all, or no size at all, or an increasingly equal partner? And one can make both arguments. Certainly at the beginning of the crisis, the Parliament played almost no role. But increasingly over time, it really pushed to as a critical voice in its reports and hearings on the eurozone and why it was failing. And it also increasingly became the go-to body for input legitimacy. Certainly that's the way the ECB used it in its own attempts to legitimate its activities and its shifting interpretations. And also the Commission went to it. So Parliament also can be seen in this Janus-faced way.
Okay, Vivien, so you've talked about the Eurozone crisis as a crisis primarily of what you're calling throughput legitimacy, but as you hinted earlier on, there also are elements in this of what you're referring to as input and output legitimacy according to the literature. And on the output side, you've already said that governing by rules and ruling by numbers had real-world output side implications for actual European citizens in terms of austerity measures in particular. And on the input side, we have seen the rise of populist parties as an expression of frustration at the lack of input legitimacy. But what's your take on how these things come together on the ground?
So yeah, good question. And what I should say is in the book, when I first started writing it, I started out with output legitimacy, then went to input, then went to throughput. But by the time I finished it, which took a number of years, lots of very good books had come out on the crisis, in particular on the political economics of the crisis. And therefore, I thought, no, I need to radically reduced what I'm saying about output legitimacy, and same for input legitimacy, although there is less out on that specifically, to focus on the throughput. But I have a very long chapter in the book on how do we think about what happened. It made more sense actually to put throughput at the beginning, because the problem, as I saw the eurozone crisis, was governing by rules and ruling by numbers. But how can we demonstrate that this was a problem? Not simply by demonstrating that the quality of the procedures was bad, but that they also didn't work, that the resulting policies didn't work. So in terms of output legitimacy, in terms of performance, what we saw were problems with the effectiveness of the policy ideas and also the performance. So in terms of the policy ideas, there was a failure in the framing. Remember that at the outset of the crisis, all of a sudden, from everyone having recognized in the financial crisis that this is a problem of private debt, the beginning of the crisis, the discourse shifts completely, largely because EU actors began reading the crisis completely off of Greece, of the Greek crisis. So they argue, this is a crisis of public debt, and they left aside the truth, which was that private debt was the problem, and most countries had ended up in high levels of public debt because they'd bailed out their banks. But with this failure of framing, saying it's about public debt, you end up with a misdiagnosis. As EU actors said, well, if it's public debt, it's because people didn't follow the rules, a behavioral explanation, as opposed to the very structure of the euro, which was the problem with all of it. But once you misframe and misdiagnose the crisis, naturally, there's a bad choice of remedies. This is about doubling down on the rules. And as a result, there's a lack of solutions. There's no fiscal solidarity. There are no Eurobonds. There's no European Monetary Fund. There's no quick bailing out of Greece and then moving on, or the ECB acting as a lender of last resort. So many different possible ways in which the EU could have solved the eurozone problems, but it did not. So we can demonstrate the lack of effectiveness of the policy ideas also, of course, by the performance and the outcomes. If we look at what happened, the eurozone was supposed to converge, and instead we get increasing macroeconomic divergence between surplus and deficit countries. We get little or uneven growth, and certainly disaster in Southern Europe. And all you have to do is contrast it with the US to see the way in which the US did not stop its fiscal stimulus nearly the way that the eurozone did. And after a much, much more severe financial crisis, it continued to grow. Whereas in the EU, you ended up with a double dip recession, and it took the EU a very long time to get better. Plus, major gaps in output gaps between, say, Germany and other Northern European countries versus Southern Europe in particular. And I suppose you might ask, well, isn't this because this is a problem of those Southern European countries? Well, remember that when we talk about legitimacy and output legitimacy, this is policy performance and good outcomes for all, not just for some. That's not legitimate. And so highly problematic in terms of the performance, and also in terms of the austerity and structural reform policies, a disaster, really, because there's a failure to take into account differences amongst member states' varieties of capitalism and growth models. So it was kind of one-size-fits-all rules that fit no one, but fit particularly badly in Southern Europe, where, and I think the irony of this is Southern European countries were told, look, you need to be like Germany, you need to be export-oriented. And then they were basically told, crush your unions, deregulate your labor markets. Well, if we think about what's the success of the export model of Northern Europe, it's about having highly organized labor markets where you can have corporatist approaches to wage bargaining. And that was destroyed in Southern Europe. So highly problematic there as well. And of course, what we see everywhere actually is a rise of inequality, increasing poverty, and still high levels of unemployment, in particular in Southern Europe. So that's all on the output legitimacy side. No wonder that we have problems with input legitimacy, political legitimacy. And you can see that although there are always problems with populism, and those were growing, they had plateaued in the early 2000s. But the minute you get the eurozone crisis, or once the policies were biting, what you see is a massive rise in Euroscepticism, in Eurosceptic parties, in populist, anti-system parties. You get, on the governing authority side, declining trust by national publics, not only of their own governments, which are doing, tweedledum, tweedledee, austerity and structural reform policies, but also for the EU level, increasingly negative image of the EU, the renationalization of debates, and new cross-cutting cleavages. We also see the sources of discontent that become much, much more important, the socioeconomics of people feeling left behind. And yes, they've been left behind for a long time, ever since the turn to neoliberalism in the 1980s. But the eurozone crisis really hits, it bites, in particular for program countries. So, but it's not only about the socioeconomics of people feeling left behind, it's the sociocultural fears that people have of a loss of status. And that morphs into the anti-migration discourses that we saw. The sort of people's fears of, oh, that person's taking my job, and concerns about identity and the changing faces of the nation. But it's not just about socioeconomics and the sociocultural. It's also about politics. The politics of take back control. And I think Brexit is a good example of that. But you certainly see it across Europe. And finally, what we see is growing political polarization, the decline of mainstream parties as people see that they're not providing any kind of an answer. Center right, center left are doing exactly the same thing. And the kinds of policies they're doing are those that the people generally are not very happy about, even though certain party constituencies may be. And even though there is a discourse that legitimated, even at the national level, austerity and structural reform. And so what we see is, with the decline of mainstream parties, is the rise of the populist Eurosceptic extremes, who then come in and say, hey, we are going to save the welfare state. Look at these mainstream parties and what they're doing. We will save the welfare state. Of course, they say, only for us, when we're talking about the extreme right. So the sort of the eurozone, the anti-euro, anti-EU kind of discourse of the right-wing extremists then morphs into or gains further strength from the migration crisis. That was not solved.
Okay, Vivien, so you've painted a picture of a crisis of legitimacy which is profound, which is complex, which is multifaceted. And the implication of that is that the remedy must be equal to the nature of the challenge. Now, in your book, you present a remedy as a more differentiated EU governance system with a soft core of states involved in various policy communities. And the implication of that, as I understand it, is that this would be a system more capable of absorbing the kind of shocks that we saw during the Eurozone crisis. But can you spell out how this would work? And can you indicate how it might avoid the risk, inadvertently, of encouraging further centrifugal fracturing of the Union?
Okay, great question. And yes, it's sort of the end. In the conclusion, I offer some solutions for the Eurozone. But I also then say, these solutions involve more democratizing the Eurozone. I see the Eurozone as actually having gone too far in deepening integration and limiting what the national level can do. And And as part of this, I say also that we have to recognize the kinds of differences amongst countries, whether they're ready to go deeper into various areas of European integration, and that in any case, over the past decade of the EU's many crises, but even before that, we've seen tremendous differentiation. Not all member states are part of all of Europe's various policy communities. And by policy communities, I mean the eurozone is one policy community, Schengen border controls is another policy community. The single market, one could argue, is the largest policy community, but everyone, in order to be part of the EU, has to be a part of that single market. So my solution is not what some leaders have proposed, which is a hardcore Europe with its own Euro Parliament, clustered around the eurozone, a kind of two-speed Europe. French presidents argued for that. It was almost like going back to the original founders with some of other added member states, but essentially thinking that you could go forward around the eurozone. I find that highly problematic. What I argue is rather than a hardcore Europe, think of the EU as a soft core Europe, as its finalité. And that is that this is actually what the EU already is, and it's overlapping clusters of member states in the EU's different policy communities. And most member states are actually in most communities, and everyone is in the single market. So, it's essentially, so here we're talking about policy areas. But what about governance in this context? And here I see a single set of EU institutions to administer and oversee all communities, in which all members exercise vote and vote in the areas in which they participate, which are many, given that they're all members of the single market, and large numbers by now, are members of the eurozone, members of Schengen, European security and defense. Anyone can be part of it, but you have to opt in as much as opt out. But for this, of course, one also needs to change the rules of governance and the unanimity rule, which is such a problem, and create supermajorities with opt-outs, turn treaty-based laws into ordinary legislation. So meaning that, the eurozone rules should be able to be open to debate and to change. But there's needs for be also more co-decision and more democracy. Involve the European Parliament and the national parliaments much more. So just to end this, sort of think about not a hardcore Europe, not a one set menu, préfixe, pas de substitution, but also not Europe à la carte, not Europe à la carte, where everyone orders different courses, but rather an elaborate gourmet menu Europe. Everyone's sitting around the table. There's one main dish, the single market. Everyone is engaged in the conversation. People or members vote only on the dishes that they consumed. They will sit out where they don't consume them, but they can exercise voice. They can't vote, but they can exercise voice on all of this. There may be guests who join the diners at the table, where they partake of the dishes. So, think of Norway, think of Switzerland. And where is the UK in all of this? Perhaps sitting, if it really goes through with Brexit, sitting at a side table, listening to the conversation. Maybe it can't join in unless it's invited, or perhaps it can be a guest joining in for a few courses. Security and defense. We just hope that it doesn't suffer indigestion.
Finally, Vivien, the book was written before the pandemic, but the tensions you speak about in the eurozone crisis were clearly reprised over the recovery package, albeit with Germany changing hands and dissociating itself from the Frugal Four. But if you were to write an epilogue to the book now, which would be in the context of the coronavirus crisis, what would you say?
That's a great question. And in fact, just as the book was going to press, the pandemic hit. And the first sentence in the preface, so I had no time to do any revisions, let alone write an epilogue about the coronavirus crisis. But I did manage to change the first sentence, because the first sentence read something like, in the eurozone crisis is arguably the worst crisis the EU has had in the past decade. Well, that wouldn't really work. So I managed to change it to, with the exception of the COVID-19 pandemic, the eurozone crisis was the worst crisis. And of course, there are lessons to be learned. And that was about all I could do as the book went to press, as the coronavirus pandemic hit, as COVID-19 hit. So here's how I see what happened, and the way I would write an epilogue, I suppose, or a prologue. So initially, in the first couple months, this was the eurozone crisis, déjà vu, all over again. I think I did a piece for Social Europe with that title. The Council was unaccountable. It failed to act as member states pursued their own policies. The ECB claimed it was not its mandate to deal with the spreads between German and Italian bonds. And of course, Italian bonds then skyrocketed in terms of the interest rate. Fortunately, the ECB pulled back on that almost immediately. But the European Parliament played no role, and the Commission was nowhere. And on top of that, it looked like the migration crisis redux as national level borders went up. But fortunately, things changed very quickly for better throughput and output legitimacy, and arguably input. The member states, think about what the member state did. They end budgetary austerity with big infusions. They just give up. They just say goodbye to the eurozone rules. They're gone on the deficit and debt rules. The Council, think about this. The Franco-German duo is back. It's no longer a dictatorship led by Germany, but it's a mutually accountable deliberative body. And here, even the Frugal Four would have to argue that they were listened to, unfortunately, because of the way in which the Ultimate Recovery Fund divided loans and grants. But still, the Franco-German duo was back, and the Council really was much more of a mutually accountable deliberative body. And the European Central Bank was the hero without any ogre-like austerity and structural reform demands. On the contrary, and it also engaged in bond buying à volonté without the kinds of limiting, constraining proportions it had been forced to deal with before. As for the Commission, ministers of moderation, no Ayatollah-like qualities at all. They accommodate the member states in every single way. They go ahead and suspend the budgetary criteria. They change or suspend the state aid rules and provide for all sorts of changes in them. They invent SURE, the employment support mechanism, using EU-owned funds, rather creating EU-level bonds. And of course, they upped the ante on what the Franco-German duo had proposed. They had proposed 500 billion euros in grants, and the European Commission ups the ante by proposing 750 billion euros in grants and loans, with 2/3 grants and 1/3 loans. And where's the European Parliament? Initially, not anywhere still, but it played a very important, has been playing, and it's still in the process of playing an important role in the budgetary fight to reinstate money for the health agency, for EU for Health, for pushing for rule of law conditionality, in particular in view of the problems with the quote unquote illiberal democracies in Hungary and Poland. So in short, what we can say is the EU seems to have learned many of the legitimacy lessons of the Eurozone crisis, perhaps with the exception of a few member states, the frugal four. But as I say this, there's still some way to go. The populist revolt that stems in part from citizens' reactions to the Eurozone crisis is not over. There needs to be continued pandemic response. There's going to have to be more money, actually, than there has been to date, although that presumably is in the cards. But importantly, the governing by rules and ruling by numbers of the Eurozone have only been suspended. They have not been officially revoked, nor have they been reformed, and they need to be. Especially they need to be done before 2 years or 3 years down the road. We have to worry if the Austerians will be back saying, oh my goodness, debt, it's so bad, it's a crisis. No, I think what we need to do is say, and this will be my final words, I think what we need to say is that one needs to recognize that debt is not debt when it involves investment in the industries and in productive growth for the future. So the kind of debt that we're talking about that involves greening the economy, digitalizing society, fighting against inequality, poverty, etc., that's what we need to talk about. So it's about not debt, but investment for growth. And that is essentially the only way to work one's way out of debt.
Well, many thanks, Vivien, for a panoramic account of the trials and tribulations of the European Union in the Eurozone crisis and more generally over the last decade. You've covered a lot of ground in 3/4 of an hour. And if listeners want to pursue those arguments and more discussion, they're in Vivien's book, Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone, which is published by Oxford University Press. So thank you, Vivien, very much for taking part today. And goodbye to you and goodbye to everyone, and take care.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to Social Europe Podcast. You can also read our articles on www.socialeurope.eu and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter @Social Europe. Until next time.